Story number 1. So there I was, 19 years old, standing backstage at this dimly lit strip club, my heart practically pounding out of my chest. I'd spent the entire day second-guessing myself. Is this really what I'm doing? But the reality of the situation didn't sink in until the moment I saw the stage lights flicker on. It was my first night, and I had exactly zero idea what I was doing. Sure, I had seen videos, heard stories, and read enough Reddit threads to fill a library, but nothing prepares you for that moment when the DJ calls your name. I wasn't even nervous until I walked out and saw the crowd. You know? It wasn't a full house, but there were enough people staring to make my palms sweat and my knees wobble. The girls before me were pros, gliding up and down the pole like they were born with high heels strapped to their feet. Then there was me. Marshall's had been my sponsor for the night, a cheap lace bra and matching underwear that I was pretty sure didn't match my skin tone. Oh, and the heels? Not stripper heels, not even close. These were the kind of heels you wear to a job interview, if the job was for an office assistant. I remember thinking, just get through this. You can quit after tonight. Just one night. But the minute I grabbed the pole, my ankle twisted and down I went, flat on my ass. Oh yeah, right there in front of a group of frat boys who looked like they were one beer away from throwing peanuts at me. The laughter was instant and loud, but not in a mean way. More like I had just given them an unexpected comedy show. Oddly enough, that moment, the fall, was what calmed me down. The embarrassment had already peaked. What was the worst that could happen now? So, I got up, smiled, and kept going. I'm pretty sure the only reason I didn't completely lose my mind was because of one regular in the front row. He looked like someone's dad, probably was someone's dad, wearing a Hawaiian shirt and nursing a whiskey sour. When I stood up, he gave me this slow, understanding clap, as if I just performed a magic trick. I made eye contact with him, and he mouthed, "You got this." It sounds cheesy, but that moment stuck with me. I was still shaking inside, but I made it through the rest of the set. I wasn't good, I know that much. But I didn't fall again, and I even managed to spin around the pole without tripping over myself. Victory. When I finally finished, I practically sprinted backstage, my heart racing in that way it does after a near-death experience. The other girls were kind of indifferent, like I was just another newbie they'd seen 100 times. One of them, though, handed me a bottle of water and said, "You didn't break anything. You're already ahead of half the girls who start here." By the time I got to the locker room, I was mentally drafting my resignation letter. But then I saw the small pile of singles stuffed into my garter. It wasn't much, maybe $50, but something about that money made me pause. It wasn't the cash itself, but what it represented. I had survived. Hell, I had made it through something that a few hours ago had felt impossible. And as crazy as it sounds, that was the turning point. Something clicked in me that night. Maybe it was the Hawaiian shirt guy, or maybe it was the fact that I had faced one of my biggest fears and come out on the other side. But suddenly, it didn't seem so scary, empowering even. I didn't quit after that night. In fact, I went back the next weekend. I had a new outfit, a proper one this time, practiced in real stripper heels, and I was determined to get better. The same regulars were there, and Hawaiian shirt guy gave me another nod as if to say, "I knew you'd be back." This time, the money was better. I didn't fall. And I even made a few people laugh on purpose. Over the next few weeks, I realized something. This wasn't just a job. It was a stage, a performance, and every night I got to play a different role. At first, it was all about survival, getting through each shift without making a fool of myself. But as the weeks went on, I started to enjoy it. There was power in the performance, in being able to control the energy in the room with just a look or a well-timed move. I became friends with some of the other dancers. The girl who handed me the water on my first night, she ended up showing me a few tricks with the pole that made me feel like I could actually do this for real. And the regulars? Some of them were surprisingly sweet. They'd come in just to talk, to laugh, and yeah, to stare at boobs. But they weren't the monsters I'd imagined. Most of them were just lonely guys looking for a break from whatever mundane lives they had outside the club. By my third month, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. I knew how to work the room, how to make small talk with customers while keeping enough distance to protect my mental space. I had a routine. I knew my worth. And I had learned the golden rule of the strip club. Confidence is everything. It doesn't matter if you're shaking inside. If you can fake it on the outside, you've already won. Sure, there were bad nights, creeps who thought they could buy more than a dance, drunk guys who didn't know how to keep their hands to themselves. But for every bad apple, there were 2 or 3 who treated me with respect, who tipped well, and who just wanted to have a good time. Looking back now, that first night was one of the hardest but most important experiences of my life. It wasn't just about stripping. It was about owning the space I was in, claiming control over my own body and how I presented it to the world. Every time I walked onto that stage after that, I wasn't just a girl in heels. I was a performer, a persona, and for those few hours each night, I had the power. Funny how a fall on stage ended up making me stand a little taller. Story number 2. It started with a Craigslist ad. I know, right? Not exactly the safest or smartest move, but back then, I wasn't exactly thinking about safety. I was thinking about rent. It was due in less than a week, and my checking account had a grand total of $23.47. I had already tried to get an extension from my landlord, but he wasn't the most flexible guy. You pay on time, or you're out. Simple as that. So there I was, 22 years old, staring at my laptop, scrolling through Craigslist like it was a last-ditch lifeline. And then I saw it. High-paying escort work available. No experience required. I clicked it, fully intending to back out after reading the details. But the next thing I knew, I was messaging the guy. 5 minutes later, I had an appointment scheduled for later that week. My first thought? What the hell are you doing? It was a nice hotel, a chain I recognized. The kind of place you stay when you want to feel classy but don't want to pay for actual luxury. I arrived early, dressed in the most professional yet sexy outfit I could throw together. Something I imagined an escort would wear in the movies. My stomach was doing somersaults. I had no idea what to expect. The guy who hired me, I'll call him Jared, met me in the hotel lobby. He was younger than I had pictured, maybe in his late 30s with a clean-cut look. You know the type. Expensive suit, perfectly styled hair, the whole deal. But what struck me most was how normal he seemed. I don't know what I had expected. A sleazy guy with a gold chain? A grizzled old man who couldn't get a date to save his life? Whatever I had in mind, Jared wasn't it. We shook hands like we were on a job interview, and he gave me this easy, reassuring smile. "You seem nervous," he said as we walked toward the elevator. "Don't worry. We're just going to talk for a while." Just talk? I wasn't sure if I was relieved or disappointed. I had prepped myself for something a lot more intense than small talk, but at the same time, I had to remind myself this was my first time. Maybe he was easing me into it. When we got to the room, he poured me a glass of wine, red, because apparently that's what you do in these situations, and we sat on the couch. We chatted for a bit, mostly about nothing. The weather, the hotel, where he was from. It all felt so normal. I was still nervous, but his calmness was contagious. For a second, it almost felt like we were on a real date, except I knew exactly how it would end. After about half an hour, he stood up and asked, "So, are you ready?" I'm not gonna lie. My heart stopped for a moment. I took a deep breath, nodded, and followed him to the bedroom. It was awkward at first. I mean, how could it not be? We didn't know each other, and this wasn't exactly a romantic scenario. But he was gentle, careful even, like he understood that this was new for me. And weirdly, that helped. The sex itself, it was fine. Not mind-blowing, but also not horrifying like some of the stories I'd read online. He wasn't rough or degrading, just matter of fact. Honestly, the worst part was how normal it all felt. Like I was just ticking off a box on a checklist. I thought I'd feel dirty or ashamed, but I didn't. Mostly, I just felt detached. Afterward, he handed me an envelope stuffed with cash. "You did great," he said, with that same reassuring smile. I wasn't sure if he meant it as a compliment or just part of the transaction, but either way, I nodded and thanked him. I left the hotel with a mix of relief and confusion. Relief because it was over, and I'd survived. Confusion because, well, it wasn't what I had expected. It wasn't glamorous or sexy, but it wasn't traumatizing either. It was just A job. That night, I counted the money. $600 for a few hours of my time. More than I'd ever made in a week at my old retail gig. And that's when the reality hit me. I could do this again. I could actually make enough money to cover rent, bills, food, everything I needed, without working myself to death at some crappy minimum wage job. It wasn't long before Jared contacted me again. I guess I passed his test because he became a regular. Over the next few months, I saw him about once a week. Each time was more or less the same: wine, small talk, sex, money. We even started to get comfortable around each other. He'd tell me about his job, his stress, how he traveled so much he barely had a personal life. And me? I told him bits and pieces about myself, carefully curating what I shared, always mindful to keep a distance. It was business after all. But here's the kicker. After a while, I realized I didn't hate it. I mean, I wasn't in love with it either, but there was something empowering about it. Jared was paying for my time, for my company, and as strange as it sounds, that gave me a sense of control. I was choosing to do this. I was setting my boundaries, and I was getting something out of it: financial security. Don't get me wrong, there were other clients, and not all of them were as easy as Jared. Some were pushy, some were awkward, and one guy I had to flat out walk away from because he crossed a line. But for the most part, I learned how to manage the situation. I knew how to read people, how to steer conversations, how to make them feel like they were getting what they paid for without giving away too much of myself. Over time, I started to see the patterns. Most of these guys weren't looking for wild, crazy sex. They were looking for companionship, for someone who would listen to them without judgment. I became a therapist in lingerie, giving them the validation they couldn't get anywhere else. And for a while, it worked. But here's the thing no one tells you. The detachment doesn't last forever. At first, it's easy to compartmentalize, to treat it like a job and keep it separate from your real life. But the longer you do it, the harder it gets to draw that line. There were days when I'd look in the mirror and wonder if I was losing pieces of myself. Like I was giving away little fragments of my soul, one client at a time. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the money, the freedom, the control. But after a while, it wasn't enough. I started feeling hollow, like I was living someone else's life. That's when I knew I had to stop. Jared was my last client. I never told him, but after our final session, I packed up and left the city. I didn't even look back. It's been a few years since then, and I've rebuilt my life. I found a job that doesn't involve hotel rooms or envelopes of cash. Sometimes I think about Jared, about those nights we spent together, and I wonder if he's still out there, paying someone else to fill the void in his life. As for me, I've moved on, but I'll never forget what that time taught me. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't empowering in the way people like to romanticize, but it was real. And for a while, it was exactly what I needed. Story number 3. When I signed up for the job, I didn't think much of it. I mean, how hard could it be to talk dirty on the phone? I'd seen enough movies to know the basic script. A seductive voice, a few moans, maybe some "oh babies," and you're good to go. The ad had promised easy money from home. Just a headset and a quiet room were all I needed. As a broke college student barely scraping by, it seemed like a no-brainer. Spoiler alert, it wasn't as easy as I thought. My first shift was on a Tuesday night. I had just finished cramming for an econ exam, and I figured I could squeeze in a few hours of work before bed. They sent me a script, told me the basics: stay flirty, keep them on the line, and most importantly, never give out personal information. Simple enough, right? Well, the first call came in, and I swear, I almost jumped out of my chair. The phone rang with this loud, electronic beep that made my heart race. I took a deep breath, put on my sexy voice, which in hindsight was probably more awkward than seductive, and answered. "Hey there," I said, dragging out the words like I'd heard actresses do in old B-movies. "What are you wearing?" Cringe, right? But it worked. The guy on the other end didn't seem to notice how nervous I was. He jumped right into it, talking about what he wanted to do to me, what he thought I looked like. I just sat there nodding along, throwing in the occasional, yeah, and, "oh, that sounds hot." Inside, I was panicking. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to hold the phone with both hands, just to keep it steady. I know it sounds weird, but it wasn't the sexual stuff that threw me off. It was how intimate it all felt, and not in a good way. I didn't expect to feel exposed. Like even though I was the one playing a role, I was still giving away pieces of myself just by pretending. The guy was talking like we'd known each other forever, and it felt strange to be on the other end of that, responding with fake enthusiasm while my brain was screaming, "What are you doing?" But here's the wild part. After the first few minutes, something strange happened. The initial shock wore off, and I found myself slipping into autopilot. My mind detached from the conversation like I was watching myself from outside my body. I realized I could say anything as long as it sounded sexy enough. I wasn't really there anymore, and that distance, it made everything a lot easier. For the next half hour, I stayed in character, giving him exactly what he wanted. He was easy to please, really, just wanted to be told how strong he was, how sexy, how much I needed him. By the end, he was breathing heavily into the phone, muttering something about how amazing I was. And then, just like that, he hung up. As soon as the line disconnected, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief wash over me. I took off the headset, leaned back in my chair, and let out a deep breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My hands were still trembling, but the worst part was over, right? First call down. Only a few dozen more to go. I grabbed a sip of water, feeling weirdly proud of myself. I'd survived. And to top it off, I'd made more in that one call than I had working 2 shifts at the campus coffee shop. But then the next call came in, and this one was different. It started out normal enough. A guy, probably in his late 30s, asking the usual questions about what I was wearing, how badly I wanted him. I answered on autopilot again, slipping into my script. But about 10 minutes in, he asked me where I lived. At first, I thought he was just role-playing, trying to make the call feel more personal. So, I responded in kind, tossing out some generic answer about being in a big city. But he pressed on, asking more specific questions. "No, really," he said, his voice low. "Which city? What neighborhood? I bet you're not far from me." I froze. My training had covered this. Don't give out personal information, don't engage with questions about your real life. But something about the way he was asking freaked me out. His voice wasn't playful anymore. It was insistent, demanding. "I don't think I can tell you that," I said, trying to keep my tone light, still playing the role. But he didn't let it go. He kept pushing, asking things like, "What's your zip code?" And, "I could come visit you, you know. I'd make it worth your while." That was when the panic set in. My brain was screaming, hang up, but for some reason I couldn't move. I was frozen, my mouth dry, my heart racing. I don't know if it was fear or just sheer disbelief that this was happening, but I stayed on the line for another 2 minutes, throwing out vague responses, trying to steer the conversation back to safer territory. Finally, I made an excuse about another call coming in and hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone, my hands shaking so badly I had to put them in my lap. The headset felt suffocating, like it was crushing my skull. I was breathing hard, trying to calm myself down, but my mind was racing. Was this guy dangerous? Could he actually track me down? What if he found me? I told myself I was overreacting. After all, this was just a phone call, right? He didn't know anything about me. But the anxiety stuck with me for the rest of the night, and every time the phone rang after that, my heart would jump into my throat. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I had a few more calls, some weird, some normal, but I was too rattled to focus. The whole time I kept thinking about that guy, about how casually he had asked for personal details. Was this normal? Did other operators deal with this, or was I just unlucky? After my shift ended, I logged out of the system and shut my laptop, feeling drained in a way I hadn't expected. I had thought this would be easy money, a fun little side gig where I could talk dirty, make a few bucks and call it a night. But it didn't feel like that anymore. It felt wrong, vulnerable, like I had opened a door into a world I didn't fully understand. I didn't quit right away. The money was too good, and I convinced myself that it was just a one-time thing, a weird call that I could forget about. But over the next few weeks, it happened again. Different guys, same creepy questions. Some were subtle, others were more direct. but each time it sent me spiraling into that same sense of fear and helplessness. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. One night, after an especially disturbing call, I logged out mid-shift and never went back. I blocked the company's number, deleted the app, and told myself I'd find another way to make ends meet. Looking back, I think what surprised me most was how easy it was to get lost in that world. How quickly it went from being a harmless job to something that messed with my head. I had always thought of phone sex work as just another form of customer service, but there's a fine line between fantasy and reality, and once it's crossed, it's hard to come back. I never told anyone about that job. To this day, it feels like a weird secret, a chapter of my life that doesn't quite fit with the rest. But every now and then when I hear that distinctive beep of an incoming call, I feel a jolt of anxiety, a reminder of the strange, unsettling world I dipped my toes into, and how fast I ran out of it. Story number 1. It was supposed to be a normal night. My buddy Greg and I had plans to meet up at his place, grab some pizza, and play video games like we always did. We'd been best friends since middle school, and Greg's house was practically my second home. I knew his mom, Deborah, really well. She was the type of mom who was more like a friend, always cracking jokes, throwing jabs at us, and never treating us like kids, even when we were. Greg's dad had left years ago, and it was just the two of them in that big house. I guess she was lonely, but I didn't think much about it. To me, Deborah was just Greg's mom, the cool lady who'd let us get away with murder as long as we didn't burn the house down. That night, though, Greg texted last minute to say he had to work late and told me to just head over anyway. He promised he'd be home within an hour, and since I lived nearby, I figured I'd just hang out until he got back. So I did what I always did. Went over, knocked once, and let myself in. Deborah was sitting on the couch, her feet up on the coffee table, watching some cheesy reality TV show. "Oh, hey there, stranger," she said, giving me a smile. "Greg running late?" "Yeah, said he'd be back soon," I replied, tossing my jacket over the back of the chair. "Mind if I wait here?" "Of course not. You want a drink or something?" Now, this wasn't weird. Deborah had offered me drinks before, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way she was sitting, her body language a little more relaxed, or maybe it was me just overthinking things. I figured I was imagining it, so I just shrugged and said, "Sure, whatever you're having." She got up, went to the kitchen, and came back with 2 glasses of wine. That should have been my first red flag. Deborah never drank with us. She usually stuck to soda or water. But again, I didn't think much of it. It was just wine, right? We sat there, watching TV, making fun of the contestants and laughing like we always did. She had this sarcastic sense of humor that was contagious. But as the show went on and we finished the first glass, she poured another and then another. Soon, the conversation started drifting from lighthearted jokes to something more personal. "You know," she said, swirling the wine in her glass, "it's been a long time since I've had a night like this, just relaxing." I nodded, not really sure what she meant. "Yeah, it's nice to unwind." She looked at me then, really looked at me, with this intensity that caught me off guard. "You've grown up a lot. I mean, I remember when you and Greg were just little boys, and now you're a man." I laughed it off, feeling a bit awkward. "Yeah, I guess time flies." There was a long pause. The show was still playing in the background, but the mood had shifted. I could feel it, even if I didn't know exactly what was happening. Deborah set her glass down and moved a little closer on the couch. Her hand rested on my knee, and I froze. "You ever think about what it's like to be lonely?" she asked, her voice soft, almost vulnerable. "I mean, really lonely?" I didn't know how to answer that. My heart was racing, and my brain was screaming at me to get up, to leave, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was stuck in this surreal moment, completely unprepared for what was happening. "I mean, I'm not that old," she continued, her hand still on my knee, her fingers tracing small circles. "But when you're single for as long as I've been, you start to miss certain things." I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. Deborah." Before I could say anything else, she leaned in and kissed me. It was soft at first, just a brush of her lips against mine, but then it deepened, and I couldn't think straight. My body reacted before my brain could catch up, and I kissed her back. The next few minutes were a blur. We moved from the couch to her bedroom, the door shutting behind us. Every alarm bell in my head was going off, but it was like I couldn't stop myself. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong. But the more I tried to resist, the more I gave in. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the fact that Greg wasn't there, or maybe it was just my own stupidity. Whatever it was, I crossed a line that night I could never uncross. When it was over, we lay there in silence, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. I couldn't look at her. I felt sick, ashamed, confused. My best friend's mom. How could I have let this happen? I should go, I mumbled, pulling on my clothes in a daze. She didn't stop me. She didn't say a word. I walked out of that house in a fog, the gravity of what I'd just done hitting me like a ton of bricks. Greg was my best friend. How was I ever going to face him again? The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache, but it wasn't the hangover that hurt the most. It was the guilt. I spent the whole day avoiding my phone, terrified that Greg would call or text. But when he finally did, it wasn't what I expected. "Hey man, sorry about last night," his text read. "I didn't get off work until way later. We still on for tonight?" I stared at the message, my heart in my throat. How was I supposed to hang out with him, knowing what I'd done? How was I supposed to sit there, play video games, and pretend like everything was fine? But I couldn't avoid him forever. That evening, I went over to Greg's place like nothing had happened. I told myself it was a one-time mistake, that I could bury it and move on. When I walked in, Deborah was in the kitchen, acting like everything was completely normal. She smiled at me, a secret hidden behind her eyes, but she didn't say anything. We sat on the couch, me and Greg, controllers in hand, playing our usual rounds of Call of Duty. I tried to focus on the game, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the night before on a loop. Every time Deborah walked by, I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, terrified she'd say something, or worse, give me a look that Greg might notice. But she didn't. Greg, oblivious as ever, was completely focused on the game, trash-talking me, like always. We ordered pizza, ate, and everything seemed fine. Almost normal. Except for the gnawing guilt in my gut. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could get away with it, pretend nothing happened, and life would go back to how it was. But that was wishful thinking. Because Deborah? She wasn't letting this go. A few days later, she started texting me. The first text was simple. "Hey, how are you doing?" I stared at it, debating whether I should respond. I finally replied with, "Fine, you." She texted back immediately. "We should talk." I knew what that meant. I knew she wasn't going to let this be a one-time thing. I ignored the message for a few hours, hoping she'd take the hint, but then another text came in. "We need to talk about what happened." I couldn't avoid her forever. I agreed to meet her, but I insisted it be somewhere public, just a coffee shop in town. I thought maybe that would make things less complicated, less tempting. When I got there, she was already seated, looking as put together as ever. We exchanged awkward hellos, and after some small talk, she finally cut to the chase. "I can't stop thinking about what happened," she said, looking me dead in the eye. I shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, look, it was a mistake. It can't happen again." She didn't seem fazed by that. "I don't think it was a mistake." I felt my stomach drop. "Deborah, it was. I mean, Greg. He's my best friend. This would destroy him." She nodded slowly, sipping her coffee, as if she hadn't already considered that. "I know, but I can't help how I feel." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "It was one night," I said, my voice more pleading than I intended. "We were both drunk. It wasn't real." But Deborah didn't seem to be on the same page. She reached across the table, grabbing my hand. "I know you felt it too." I pulled my hand back like I'd touched fire. "Deborah, this can't happen." She stared at me for a long moment, and then, to my surprise, she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill down my spine. "If you say so," she said, standing up and grabbing her purse. "But just remember, you're the one who started it." I sat there, stunned, as she walked out of the coffee shop like nothing had happened. My heart was pounding. What did she mean by that? I hadn't started anything. She kissed me first. She invited me into her bedroom. I was just along for the ride, right? But the way she said it, so calm and certain, made me second-guess everything. I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a whole lot worse. And they did. A week later, Greg confronted me out of the blue. He didn't beat around the bush. "Are you messing around with my mom?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. I froze, every part of me screaming to lie, to deny it, to say something, anything, that would save what was left of our friendship. But I couldn't. He knew, and I had no way out. Story number 2. I never saw it coming. Not from her. It was my friend Ryan's birthday party, one of those small get-togethers with just a few of us hanging out at his house. We had all been friends since high school, but now that we were in our late 20s, these types of gatherings were fewer and further between. Everyone was either busy with work or in relationships or just doing adult stuff. But when Ryan invited me, I couldn't say no. We had been tight for years, and it was always a good time when the group got together. Ryan still lived at home with his mom, Lisa. His dad had passed away when we were in college, and after that, Lisa had sort of retreated from the social scene. But she was a great lady, always making sure we had food or drinks or whatever we needed when we hung out. She was like a second mom to most of us. So when I showed up at Ryan's house that night, I didn't think twice about the fact that it was just me, Ryan, and Lisa hanging around at first. Ryan said a couple of other friends were coming, but they were running late. We started off the night with drinks, Lisa offering us a couple of beers while Ryan put on a game. We were lounging in the living room, the atmosphere relaxed, laughing about old memories and inside jokes. Eventually, a few other people arrived, and the party picked up a little. Music, pizza, and more drinks flowed, and the hours flew by. At some point, Ryan disappeared with his girlfriend, probably to get some privacy in the upstairs bedroom. It was typical of him, vanishing when things got quiet, leaving the rest of us to our own devices. And before I realized it, most of the other guests had either passed out or left altogether. I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with just Lisa. We had been talking on and off all night. Nothing serious, just casual conversation. But the drinks were hitting harder than I expected, and I felt this strange tension building between us. It didn't make sense. This was Lisa, Ryan's mom. She wasn't just some random woman I could flirt with, except she wasn't exactly acting like Ryan's mom that night. "You've grown up so much," she said, taking a slow sip from her wine glass. She was sitting across from me, her gaze lingering on me a little longer than it should have. I tried to laugh it off, but the comment left me feeling unsettled. "I guess we all have," I said, glancing at the clock. It was past 1 a.m. How had the night slipped by so fast? "You're not like the other boys, though," she continued, her voice softer now, more serious. "You're different. You've always been so kind, so thoughtful." I shifted in my chair, not sure where this was going. "Thanks, Lisa. You've always been great to all of us. You didn't have to take care of us all these years, but you did." She smiled at me, and for the first time, I noticed just how pretty she was. Lisa had always been attractive, in that graceful, mature way. But tonight, it felt different. Her blonde hair was falling loose around her shoulders, and she was wearing this low-cut dress that I had barely noticed before. Was she always this confident, or was it the wine talking? "Sometimes I wonder if I'm a little too lonely," she said, her voice dropping as she looked into her wine. "It's hard, you know, being here without anyone. Ryan's grown up, doing his own thing. I'm just here." I didn't know what to say. I should have said something reassuring, something neutral. But instead, I found myself leaning in, listening closely, my eyes tracing the curve of her neck, the way she bit her lip as she spoke. "I know it's hard," I finally managed to say. "You've been through a lot, but you're not alone. You've got us." She smiled again, but this time it was different. This smile wasn't the warm, motherly smile I was used to. It was something else. "That's sweet of you. But it's not the same, is it?" The air between us felt heavy. I couldn't think straight. Was she flirting with me? Was I imagining it? I should have gotten up and left right then, but I didn't. I just sat there, staring at her, feeling this magnetic pull between us. Then she leaned forward, her hand reaching across the table to rest on mine. Her touch was soft, but electric, sending a shock through my body. "You've always been so good to me," she whispered. Before I could respond, she stood up, walked around the table and leaned down, her face just inches from mine. Her perfume was intoxicating, mixing with the wine on her breath. My heart was pounding in my chest. "Lisa, I started, but before I could finish, her lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, just a gentle press of lips. But then it deepened, and I was lost. I kissed her back. I knew I shouldn't have, but I did. We stumbled toward the couch, knocking over an empty beer bottle as we went. Everything felt like it was moving in fast forward. 1 minute, we were kissing, and the next, clothes were hitting the floor. I wasn't thinking straight. I wasn't thinking at all. The next thing I knew, we were tangled up together on the couch, and I was doing the one thing I had never imagined myself doing, hooking up with my best friend's mom. When it was over, we just lay there, breathing heavily, the weight of what had just happened slowly sinking in. I couldn't believe it. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. "I should go," I mumbled, sitting up and reaching for my clothes. But as I fumbled to get dressed, I heard footsteps coming down the stairs. I froze. "Ryan." I barely managed to get my shirt on before he walked into the living room, rubbing his eyes. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw us. I don't know what gave it away, the scattered clothes, the look on my face, or the way Lisa was awkwardly sitting there trying to cover herself with a throw blanket. But he knew. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice shaking with disbelief. "Are you serious?" "Ryan, it's not," I started to say, but the words caught in my throat. What was I supposed to say? That it was a mistake? That I hadn't meant for it to happen? None of that would make a difference. He had caught me, and there was no going back. He didn't wait for an explanation. His face twisted with anger, and before I knew it, he had me pinned against the wall, his fist clenched, ready to swing. "You're my best friend," he shouted. "How could you do this?" I didn't fight back. I couldn't. I just stood there, waiting for the punch that I knew I deserved. But it never came. He let go of me, his face pale with shock and rage. "Get out," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Get the hell out of my house." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my jacket and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove home, the weight of what I had just done settled over me like a heavy fog. I had ruined everything. Ryan never spoke to me again after that. I lost my best friend that night, all because of one stupid, impulsive mistake. I tried texting him, calling him, but it was no use. He had cut me off completely. Lisa tried to reach out a few times, but I ignored her. I couldn't face her, couldn't face what we had done. The guilt was too much. Months passed, and the group fell apart. Without Ryan, there was no glue holding us together. Everyone went their separate ways, and I was left alone, haunted by the memory of that night. I still think about it sometimes, how one moment of weakness can destroy years of friendship. How a decision made in the heat of the moment can change everything. I'll never forgive myself for what happened that night. And I know Ryan won't either. Story number 1. That night, after my friend's message, I couldn't sleep. I was lying next to him, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how we got here. How had I missed it? The late nights, the secret texts, the distant stares. And the worst part? He was right there, inches away, sleeping like nothing was wrong, like nothing had ever been wrong. The next morning, I decided I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. I wanted to see just how far this would go. I wanted to see if he would break on his own, if the weight of his lies would catch up to him. So I waited. I pretended like everything was normal. I smiled when I didn't want to. I kissed him goodnight when I felt like throwing up. But inside, I was watching. Every move, every word, every look, cataloged in my mind, each one a small confirmation of the betrayal I already knew existed. He didn't make it easy. In fact, he started to relax, thinking that I had backed off, that I had let go of my suspicions. He began leaving his phone lying around again, though I noticed it always locked as soon as he stepped away. Still, the tension in the air was thick, unspoken but undeniable. I could feel it pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. A few weeks later, I decided to test him. I told him I had a work trip out of town and would be gone for the weekend. I wanted to see what he'd do with the opportunity. I wanted to see how long it would take for him to run to her. As expected, he didn't waste any time. The second I was gone, he was at her place. I didn't have to guess because I saw it with my own eyes. My friend, the same one who had messaged me before, had agreed to help me confirm everything. She followed him that night, snapping pictures as he left our apartment and drove straight to Lauren's. She even managed to snap a picture of them leaving together later, holding hands like they were some kind of happy couple. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I felt numb. All the signs had been there, yet seeing it, having undeniable proof, it was like a knife to the heart. I spent that night in my hotel room staring at the pictures, feeling the reality of it wash over me again and again. This was it. There was no going back. When I got home, I didn't confront him right away. I couldn't. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing he had gotten under my skin. Instead, I acted like everything was fine. I smiled, laughed, pretended like I hadn't just seen the evidence of his betrayal. He looked so comfortable in his lies, so at ease in our relationship, that I almost envied him. He had no idea what was coming. A week passed, then another. I kept the pictures tucked away, hidden like a secret weapon. And the more I waited, the more I realized something important. This wasn't just about the cheating. This was about the manipulation, the gaslighting, the way he had twisted reality so many times that I'd started to doubt my own instincts. Finally, I decided it was time. One evening after dinner, I sat him down. I didn't want a scene. I didn't want yelling or screaming. I just wanted the truth, something I knew he wouldn't willingly give me. So, how was your weekend? I asked, casually. Good, he said, without missing a beat. Just hung out with Jake, the usual. I nodded. And Lauren? How's she doing? The look on his face was priceless. For the first time in months, I saw him stumble. He blinked, eyes darting away from mine for a split second, but long enough for me to see the panic flash across his face. Lauren? He asked, feigning confusion. What about her? I know you were with her, I said calmly. I know everything. There was a long pause. I watched as he processed what I was saying, trying to figure out how much I actually knew. His jaw tightened, his hands fidgeted slightly, but still he didn't speak. You don't have to lie anymore, I said. I saw the pictures. I know you've been seeing her. His whole demeanor shifted. The confident, dismissive attitude he had been carrying for months melted away. He looked smaller, like a kid who had been caught stealing from the cookie jar. And yet, even in that moment, he tried to twist it. I'm sorry, he said, finally, but it's not what you think. It was just… I don't know, I got caught up in something. It didn't mean anything. I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. Didn't mean anything? You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around behind my back, and now you want to tell me it didn't mean anything? I didn't want to hurt you, he said, and I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. I didn't know how to stop it. You didn't want to hurt me? I repeated, shaking my head. You've been hurting me every day with your lies. You made me feel like I was crazy, like I was imagining things. You gaslighted me. You made me doubt myself. His eyes dropped to the floor. I'm sorry, he whispered again. But I didn't want his apology. Not anymore. I wanted to be free of him, of the lies, of the constant second-guessing. I had already made my decision. I had made it the night I saw those pictures. You need to leave, I said, standing up. He looked up at me, confused. What? I said, you need to leave. I'm done. For a moment, he just stared at me, as if he couldn't quite process what I was saying. Then, slowly, he stood up too. Wait, he said. We can work this out. I'll end it with her. I'll do whatever you want. But his words felt empty, hollow. I had heard them all before, in one form or another. Promises made to soothe the guilt, to buy time. I wasn't buying anymore. No, I said firmly. We're done. Story number 2. So, I never thought I'd be the type to have one of these stories. I mean, in my mind, cheating was something that happened to other people. The ones who missed obvious signs like lipstick on collars or secretive text messages. But nope, turns out I was that person, blindsided and naive. It started innocently enough. My boyfriend of 3 years, Eric, suddenly became a fitness junkie. Now, to put things in perspective, this man had never stepped foot in a gym the entire time we'd been together. He was more of a Netflix and fries kind of guy. But out of nowhere, he decided he was going to get healthy. And okay, cool, right? We're getting older, gotta stay fit. I was all for it. At first. The thing was, his gym sessions always seemed to be at the weirdest hours. Like 11 p.m., midnight. He'd just throw on his old ratty sneakers and say he was off to the gym. I'd be half asleep on the couch when he'd casually lean over to kiss my forehead, whisper, "See you in a bit, babe," and then head out the door. I remember thinking, who the hell works out at midnight? But Eric was always full of surprises, so I brushed it off. Maybe he just wanted to avoid the crowds or something. Whatever. Plus, I trusted him, so no big deal. Until one night, around 2 a.m., I woke up and realized he still wasn't home. I called him, no answer. Texted, nothing. And when he did finally stumble in around 3 a.m., he smelled like cologne. Expensive cologne. The kind that costs more than my rent. And let me tell you, Eric didn't own cologne. He was strictly an Old Spice body wash and call it a day type of guy. I asked him about it, but he just laughed it off and mumbled something about some guy at the gym spilling cologne on him. Yeah, at 3 in the morning. In my half-asleep state, I just accepted the answer. It sounded weird, but again, I trusted him. Then came the work trips. Eric never used to travel for work, and suddenly he was being sent out of town almost every other weekend. "Babe, corporate's expanding," he'd explain, his eyes always glued to his phone while he packed a bag with far too much care. "It's just for a few days. I'll bring you back a souvenir." Spoiler, he never brought me anything. By this point, my gut was screaming at me, but my brain was still in denial. Then one fateful weekend, I had a friend's birthday party to attend. Eric had left for one of his work trips, and I was trying to keep busy so I didn't miss him too much. At the party, one of my friends brought up a guy she had seen at a local bar the night before. This guy looked just like Eric. Same tattoos, same goofy smile, same everything. I laughed it off at first. "Nah, that can't be Eric. He's out of town for work." My friend shrugged, but then showed me a blurry phone photo she'd taken. There he was, my boyfriend, sitting at a bar a few miles away, arm casually draped over some girl I didn't recognize. That's when it hit me like a truck. This man wasn't out of town. He wasn't even out of the neighborhood. Fueled by a mix of disbelief and too much wine, I called him. He answered on the second ring, which shocked me since I assumed he'd be with the mystery woman. "Hey babe, what's up?" His voice was casual, like he wasn't committing emotional manslaughter. "Where are you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "At the hotel, just finished a late dinner with the team," he replied smoothly. There was no hesitation in his voice. Man, this guy was good. I didn't say anything for a second, just listened to the background noise. I could hear clinking glasses, soft music, definitely not hotel room vibes. "That's funny," I said finally, "because a friend of mine just sent me a picture of you at Joe's bar last night." Dead silence. I must have forgotten to mention I stopped by there after work," he stammered, but I could hear the panic rising in his voice. "Forgot to mention. Eric, you've been out of town for 3 days." I could practically hear him sweating on the other end. At this point, I had two options. Continue this phone interrogation or just end it then and there. Being the petty person I am, I decided to play along a little longer. I told him we'd talk when he got back and hung up. I spent the rest of the weekend vacillating between fury and disbelief. I mean, 3 years? 3 years of my life down the drain for this? When he finally came home that Sunday, he walked in like nothing had happened, like he wasn't just caught red-handed. "Hey babe, I brought you a keychain from the hotel gift shop," he said, with that goofy smile that used to make my heart melt. Now it just made my stomach turn. Cool, I said, deadpan. Where's the girl you were with at the bar? And just like that, the facade crumbled. He didn't even bother denying it. Turns out, his midnight gym sessions were just code for sneaking off to see her. She worked late shifts at the hospital nearby, so they'd meet up after. The work trips? Same story. Weekends with her. It was a mess. I kicked him out, obviously, and he had the nerve to ask if we could still be friends. Yeah, no thanks. I'm good. Anyway, that's the story of how I got dumped for a nurse with a better sense of direction. Now, every time I hear someone say they're going to the gym at midnight, I laugh, because sure, buddy, sure you are. Story number 3. Looking back, I don't know how I didn't see it earlier. All the signs were there, bright red flags waving in the wind, but I was too deep in the comfort of routine to notice. I guess it all started when she suggested we take a road trip. We'd been together for nearly 6 years at that point, and road trips were kind of our thing. We used to just hop in the car, no set destination, and drive until we found some quirky small town or a scenic lookout. It was our way of reconnecting, especially after her busy work weeks. So when she suggested we take a weekend trip, I was excited. I thought, this is exactly what we need. But something was different this time. Usually, she was the one to pack snacks, make playlists, and even insist on taking silly Polaroids at every stop. This time, she barely seemed interested. We left the house later than planned because she couldn't decide what to wear. We were only going for a weekend. It's not like we needed to pack our entire closet. But when I glanced into her bag, it was full to the brim, almost like she was planning to stay longer. I chalked it up to her indecisiveness. She was notorious for overpacking. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. The first weird thing happened halfway through the drive. We were on a stretch of highway with nothing but rolling hills and the occasional gas station. Usually, this is when we'd start singing along to whatever song came on, laughing at our off-key harmonies. But this time, she was quiet. Too quiet. She sat there, glued to her phone, typing furiously. I casually asked, "Who's keeping you so busy over there?" She looked up, startled, like I'd caught her doing something illegal. "Oh, it's just work stuff. You know how it is," she said, waving her hand dismissively before turning back to her phone. Work stuff. On a Saturday. Right? That night, we stayed at this cute little B&B. Or it would have been cute if she hadn't seemed like she was miles away. She was barely present, scrolling through her phone at dinner, offering up half-hearted responses to my attempts at conversation. The next morning, she insisted on going for a walk while I slept in. I thought nothing of it, grateful for the extra hour of sleep. But when I woke up and checked my phone, I noticed something odd. She had left her location services on, which she never did. Curious, I opened the map. She wasn't at the local park like she said she'd be. She was in the parking lot of a nearby diner, alone. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but my heart started racing. I mean, why lie about something so trivial? Why say you're going for a walk when you're sitting at some random diner? When she came back, I tried to brush off the suspicion. I even convinced myself that maybe she just needed some time alone. Relationships are complicated. We all need space, right? But that night, when we were supposed to drive home, she dropped the bombshell. We were packing up the car when she casually said, "You know, maybe we should stay another night." "Another night?" I asked, confused. "But we both have work tomorrow." "Yeah, but I feel like I need more time. I've been thinking a lot lately." She trailed off, looking out the window as if searching for the right words. Suddenly, it felt like the walls were closing in. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. The something's wrong feeling that had been building up over the last few months. I knew where this conversation was going, but I wasn't ready to hear it. "Thinking about what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know. Us." She finally turned to look at me, and there it was. The truth, lingering just behind her eyes, waiting to break free. I could feel my throat tighten. Are you saying you want to break up?" She sighed, avoiding eye contact. "I don't know. Maybe." The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out. 6 years. We had 6 years together, and now she maybe wanted out. I could have exploded right then, demanded answers, but instead, I just sat there, numb. "Why?" I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper. She took a deep breath. "It's just, I've been feeling distant. And, well, there's someone else." There it was. The words that turned my world upside down. Someone else. I didn't even know what to say. What do you say to that? Part of me wanted to scream, but all I could do was sit there in shock. I think I asked something stupid like, "How long?" "A few months," she replied, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I think I need to see where this goes." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This entire trip, this weekend that I thought was meant to reconnect us, was actually her way of softening the blow. She had planned to tell me all along, and I had been blind to it. Without saying another word, I grabbed my keys and walked out to the car. I don't know why, but I couldn't stay in that room any longer. She followed me, of course, pleading with me to talk, but I couldn't. I couldn't look at her. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. We drove home in complete silence. No music, no conversation. Just miles of empty highway and the sound of my heart shattering with every passing minute. When we finally got back, she packed up the rest of her things and left. Just like that. I'd love to say I handled it with grace, but honestly, I was a mess for weeks. Months even. Every time I thought about that trip, I couldn't help but feel like an idiot for not seeing the signs sooner. The distant conversations, the constant texting, the sudden need for alone time. It was all right there in front of me, but I was too blind to see it. In the end, I realized that the person I thought I knew, the person I had spent 6 years with, wasn't who she really was anymore. People change, I guess, but man, it hurts when they do.